A young woman vanished from sight after pulling into the school's parking lot to attend a sporting event. Soon, everyone was in for a very unsettling discovery, and the police were called in to investigate. Detectives worked on this eerie mystery for a total of 28 years, and none of them had any idea that this would be the first case of its kind. On June 12, 1975, Sarah Yarborough was born in Portland. Her parents relocated to the town of Federal Way in another state not too long after. It is practically a suburb of Seattle and is located close to it. Along with having two brothers, Sarah was very close to her younger brother and assisted her parents in caring for him. Sarah had a background in ballet and music from a young age. The girl always wanted to get into a reputable college, so she worked hard in school. She took part in the school program and flew twice to New Zealand because of her academic performance. Sarah afterwards joined the cheerleading squad at her school. She was a compassionate and non-judgmental individual who tried to assist anyone in need, and she had a large number of friends. When Sarah was 16 years old, her cheerleading squad got together for an event on Saturday morning, December 14, 1991. They were all together at the school building, waiting for the bus to come get them. Sarah was the only one who misjudged the time when she drove to school in her father's car. The bus was not supposed to arrive until 9 in the morning, but she mistakenly believed it would pick them up at 8. Gradually, all of her friends began to show up, but none of them noticed Sarah. When the bus carrying the students arrived, some of the students noticed a car in the parking lot, but the young woman was not there. While her friends found this odd, nobody was able to get in touch with Sarah because none of them had cell phones at the time. Two boys, aged 12, were strolling around the school premises at approximately the same moment. They saw a strange man as they strolled through the wood area behind the school tennis courts. He emerged from behind some bushes, gave them a strange look, and turned to leave. The kids think he is strange, but they ignored him and continued on. A startling scene was waiting for them a short distance away. A young woman, lifeless and lying on the ground. The school children ran home to tell their parents they thought she had died. The father of one of the boys chose to follow the suspicious man that the kids had spotted, while the parents of the other boy accompanied him to the location. His son informed him that he witnessed a vehicle that appeared to be a Chevrolet Nova leaving that location. His father made the decision to go outside and attempt to locate that car because he lived close to the school. He was able to locate a car that looked similar at one point, but it vanished from his view quickly, making it impossible for him to locate it again. The parents of the other boy arrived at the school in the meantime and saw that the girl on the ground was most likely dead. They hurried to the school building right away and dialed 911. When the police arrived, they were able to confirm that the young lady had passed away. It did not take them long to ascertain that Sarah was the deceased. The officers deduced that the victim had most likely been strangled based on the marks on her neck. There were only a few of her possessions, a jacket, underwear and socks, near the body. Officers suspect that the attacker may have attacked her right next to the car and then dragged her behind the trees because they discovered her purse and car keys inside the vehicle in the school parking lot. After transferring the body to the medical examiners, the police started searching for any hints. Interviewing everyone who was on or close to the school grounds was their initial step. The man that had emerged from behind the bushes close to Sarah's body was roughly described by the two guys who discovered her. They described him as a tall man in his early 20s, dressed in black pants, a dark raincoat, and shoulder-length blonde hair. The police soon located another witness, and when they did, they discovered an extremely shocking tale. In the same forested area, a man going for a jog came upon an odd sight. The witness believed that a couple had simply chosen to have some privacy as the young woman lay motionless next to the bushes with a man hovering over her. The man and the young woman were still there when he ran the opposite way down the same road a short while later. He did not feel that he was witnessing a crime being committed in either of the two instances. The witness himself told the police that he did not know what behavior was typical in his new country because he had just recently immigrated to the United States from another culture. Still, the witness gave the police a general description of the murderer that matched the kid's story of how the body was found. Several dozen more people who had been in the vicinity of the school were questioned by detectives, but no more pertinent leads were discovered. Meanwhile, doctors examined Sarah's body and determined that her death was caused by strangulation. It appears that the offender used her own underwear, and the young lady's head had sustained a significant injury. Assuming that the victim lost consciousness from this blow, the experts concluded that the story of the runner was true. He noticed that the young lady on the ground remained motionless. Upon examining Sarah's clothing, forensic investigators discovered remnants of the same male DNA on nearly every article. However, in 1991, there was no shared DNA database, so the only method the investigators had was to compare the DNA samples of particular suspects directly. An additional detail was brought to the detectives' notice. The medical examiner reported that there were no indications of assault on Sarah's body, despite the fact that forensic scientists discovered male DNA residue on her clothing. After obtaining all of this data, investigators developed their own theories about what transpired. Sarah was the only one in the parking lot when she arrived at the school nearly an hour early. Sarah's attacker most likely saw her there, waited for the girl to exit the vehicle, struck her in the head with an object, and caused her to pass out. After that, he dragged her out of the parking lot and behind the trees, where her body was discovered later. After stripping off some of her clothes and abusing her, the offender strangled the victim with her own stockings. Detectives were disappointed to learn that the driver of the Chevrolet Nova, which they had searched for after one of the children who discovered Sarah's body, had informed them about the vehicle in which the perpetrator had allegedly fled the scene, had actually just finished delivering donuts that morning. He gave a sample of his DNA, which did not match what was on Sarah's clothing. Seemingly, the children only noticed the vehicle traveling beside them and assumed the culprit was at the wheel. Alas, none of the boys could remember for certain whether they saw a man coming from the bushes toward any car. Police continued to look for witnesses and fresh leads over the following few days, but they did not make any noteworthy progress. Classes resumed on Monday, despite the fact that everyone was appalled by what had transpired. Not only had the murder occurred a short distance from their school, but the perpetrator was still at large, and nobody knew who he was. The male athletes made plans to accompany each student to the vehicle or bus so that they would not be left on the streets, since the young ladies were scared to stroll the premises by themselves. Detectives interviewed each of the roughly 70 possible witnesses they identified that morning in and around the school, but they were unable to obtain any additional information. A rough picture of the murderer was put together and sent to all of the local newspapers and television stations based on the testimony of the two children and the jogger. Numerous media outlets covered the story, and in the weeks that followed, the police received hundreds of tips. Investigators looked into each one, but they all came to a standstill. They once had a tip regarding a man with a criminal past who fit the killer's description. However, there was a setback for the detectives. His DNA did not match that of the offender. The case has been on hold for several months since then. The police attempted to follow up on each of the roughly 4,000 leads they had received in total, but their resources were simply insufficient to handle the volume of data. Time also worked against them, since new cases needed to be looked into every month while investigators looked for the offender. When Sarah's family discovered that the police did not have enough resources to handle all of the tips, her grandfather attempted to assist as much as he could. He was employed by a technology company and he persuaded management to temporarily donate a $100,000 computer with extreme processing power to the police department. Even though it was an enormous amount in the 1990s, management approved of it. Police officers could process leads more quickly, sort them into an easy-to-read format, and store all the information about the leads in one location with this computer. In spite of everything, they were unable to follow any lead, and in the years that followed, they made no progress. Sarah's classmates graduated 2 years later, and before they did, they decided to honor their friend. They were able to raise a substantial amount of money, which they used to build a memorial. It was a bench with metal castings of Sarah's belongings on it. A picture of the young woman's dog reaching for her purse was placed next to these items. The case was repeatedly reopened in the years that followed, and all the evidence was once again examined, but the outcome remained the same. They still had not been able to apprehend the offender. The police conducted thousands of interviews and collected DNA samples from almost 300 potential suspects during this time, but their findings were all ambiguous. 20 years after the murder, in 2011, the new detective made the decision to use contemporary technology. He was made aware of a business that started doing genetic genealogy research. When the policeman asked if they could try to find the relatives of the person whose DNA was found on the victim's body, the experts took up the task. Sadly, they were unsuccessful. First of all, in 2011, genetic genealogy was only beginning to gain popularity, and the experts' knowledge was quite restricted. For instance, they do not know how to look for both male and female relatives in the same sample. They could only search for family ties with other men if they shared a man's DNA, and vice versa. Second, a number of laws that forbade the use of genetic data samples to find relatives of suspects presented them with yet another challenge. It did, however, bore some interesting fruit. Firstly, the group of scientists that the investigator had contacted had already spent a number of years assembling a genetic genealogy of the original settlers who arrived in America in 1620 from Great Britain aboard the Mayflower. They learned that the assassin of Sarah was related to Robert Fuller, a passenger on the ship, through analyzing his DNA. But it was nearly impossible to track him down in this chain, particularly during those years. Although there were only a little more than 100 passengers on the ship, more than 25 million people have descended from them over the ages. Second, the detectives were unaware that he had made the Sarah Yarborough case the first of its kind. Although his idea was not successful, it was the first crime that was attempted to be solved using genetic genealogy. Using what information he could find, the detective located multiple men living in the town's vicinity at the time of Sarah's murder who shared the Fuller surname. He found pictures of them and went up to the 2 men who found the body when they were kids and the jogger who was one of the witnesses. Sadly, neither of them was able to identify the murderer in the picture. At last, the investigators requested DNA samples from every Fuller in the vicinity, which they then sent to a lab. Even though none of them matched the murderer's DNA, an intriguing thing happened in this case. In fact, one of those men was a distant descendant of Robert Fuller from that very ship, as the experts proved. He was undoubtedly not the murderer, though, and he was also unaware that any distant relatives resided nearby. He might have been related to the offender so distantly that their family was unaware of the relationship. In 2017, the detective retired, and a new team took up the case. Investigators returned to the company that had taken the killer's DNA sample in 2011. By then, genetic material analysis had progressed significantly, and specialists decided to attempt determining the offender's ancestry. It took 2 entire years. The experts manually attempted to trace the killer's family ties and get in touch with people who were living in Federal Way at the time of Sarah's death by searching through public databases for even the most distant relatives of the murderer. Ultimately, they had to eliminate thousands of candidates before they struck it lucky. Experts concluded that there was a good chance the DNA sample from Sarah's clothing belonged to one of the two brothers. One was 33 years old and the other was 27 at the time of the murder. The older one proved to be a felon with a noteworthy criminal history. Since his DNA sample was in the FBI database and he had served time in prison for violent crimes, it was evident that he was not involved in Sarah's murder. If he had been, his DNA would have matched evidence from the 1990s. Regarding Patrick Nicholas, the younger brother, the police had him under suspicion for violent crimes, including crimes against minors, but that was before the criminal's DNA samples were entered into the database. Detectives set up a surveillance system for the man right away. He was 55 years old and lived in Wellington, a nearby town. After 2 days of the police observing everything he did, the chance finally arrived. After going to the laundry, Patrick went outside to smoke and threw his cigarette butt on the ground while he waited for his clothes to be washed. Without delay, a police officer placed it in an evidence bag and went back to his vehicle. The second time Patrick went outside to smoke, a red handkerchief fell out of his pocket. The man did not pick it up and returned to the laundry room. The police were happy to collect the second piece of evidence in case the experts could not obtain a sample of DNA from the butt of the cigarette. But the specialists were able to take samples from each of these things with ease, and the following day they gave the detective the much-awaited update. The DNA of Patrick and the DNA discovered on Sarah's clothing in 1991 matched exactly. The man was taken into custody by the police after the judge promptly issued an arrest warrant for him. From the time investigators learned his name to the formal filing of murder charges, it all took 5 days. Many asked the very reasonable question, why was a man with such a criminal history not even considered a suspect for all those 28 years? After his biography was leaked to the media, Patrick Nicholas, then 19 years old, tried to assault a young woman after approaching her and getting into her car. The victim was able to get away, but not before having to jump into the river and swim a considerable distance to get away from the attacker safely. After serving 4 years in jail, Patrick was allowed to leave. In 1994, he attempted to abuse a young woman who was underage, which led to his next arrest by the police. Although he was arrested once more, no database had his DNA on file. That has a peculiar explanation. The article for which he was prosecuted was not difficult enough to obtain DNA, and the police never came across his name in 3 decades. Additionally, he was absent from all 4,000 leads that were gathered over time. It also revealed the reason why specialists in genetic genealogy were unable to link them to Robert Fuller. As it turned out, Patrick's biological grandfather was raised under the adopter family name after being adopted. One of the men who found Sarah's body when they were kids in 1991 declared right away that Patrick was the murderer. He acknowledged that the experience had left a lasting impression on him. When the body was found, he was just 12 years old, and the murderer had seen his face. The witness had been living in constant fear that Patrick would kill him for years, and he did not feel safe until Patrick's arrest. The trial for Patrick did not start until 2023. He maintained his innocence, and his attorney attempted to refute the primary piece of evidence, the DNA test. He believed that the fact that Patrick's sperm was found on the young woman's cloth did not establish his guilt, but this argument was rejected. The attorney also attempted to dispute the validity of the DNA analysis itself, but the experts ruled that these arguments were wholly unfounded. Ultimately, Patrick was determined to have committed first-degree murder without intending to kill. He was essentially given no chance of ever being released from prison when he was sentenced to 45 years and 8 months on May 25. Patrick was unmoved at the pronouncement of the sentence. Sarah's relatives also addressed the judge, thanking everyone involved in the trial and the investigators for bringing the killer to justice after he had evaded justice for 28 years. On September 12, 1988, Lawrence, Massachusetts was rocked to its core by a tragic event. The lifeless body of an 11-year-old girl named Melissa Tremblay was discovered brutally stabbed to death and abandoned on the train tracks near the Boston and Maine railway yard. This senseless act of violence left the community in a state of shock, anger, and profound sadness. The question on everyone's mind was, who could commit such a heinous act? The search for justice would span 35 years before the perpetrator was finally apprehended. Nestled along the picturesque banks of the Merrimack River, Lawrence is a vibrant and thriving city that seamlessly blends small-town charm with the excitement of a bustling metropolis. The heartbeat of the city is fueled by its diverse and passionate residents, whose unwavering pride and love for their community can be felt in every corner. As you stroll through the bustling streets of Lawrence, a palpable sense of history and heritage permeates the air, as if the very bricks and stones whisper tales of the past. Lawrence holds a significant place in American labor history, as it was here that the historic Bread and Roses strike of 1912 unfolded, marking a turning point in the fight for workers' rights and social justice. However, amidst this rich tapestry of history, tragedy struck in 1988. Melissa Tremblay, born in 1977 to her mother Janet Tremblay in Salem, Massachusetts, fell victim to a horrific crime. Raised by her single mother, Janet, Melissa, affectionately known as Missy, attended Lancaster School and was adored by her peers. Described as a carefree, fun-loving, and compassionate little girl, she had a wide circle of friends and always brought joy to those around her. Melissa's favorite playground was the Boston and Maine railway yard, where she would spend countless hours running and playing amidst the train tracks, while her mother visited friends at a nearby social club. Tragically, it was in this very place that her life was cut short, forever altering the lives of those who loved her. On September 11, 1988, Melissa accompanied her mother and her boyfriend to the La Salle Social Club in Lawrence, not far from the railway. While the adults stayed inside, Melissa went outside to play. The last sightings of her alive were reported by a railroad employee and a pizza delivery driver who were in the vicinity during the late afternoon hours of that day. When Janet realized her daughter was missing, she frantically searched the area before reporting her disappearance to the police at around 9 p.m. that night. Janet returned home in a state of panic, desperately hoping for news of her daughter's safety. Tragically, she would never receive such news. On the morning of September 12, 1988, Melissa's lifeless body was discovered in the old Boston and Maine railway yard in Lawrence. She had been brutally stabbed to death, and her leg was amputated post-mortem when a train ran over her body. Detectives theorized that the killer had intentionally mutilated the body in an attempt to remove any potential physical evidence. The state police and Lawrence police launched an extensive investigation into Melissa's murder, thoroughly searching the railroad yard and other locations, including the Lancaster Grammar School, where Melissa was a student. The community was shocked and devastated by the heinous crime that had occurred in their small town. Leading the case was Lawrence police officer, Detective Thomas Murphy, who was appalled by the brutality of the murder. Determined to bring justice for Melissa, Detective Murphy and his team collected physical evidence from the crime scene and the victim's body, although the specific nature of this evidence was never disclosed. However, the forensic team analyzing the body did determine that the stab wounds indicated the killer was left-handed. Since no arrests were made at the time, it is presumed that the evidence collected was not viable for the investigation, leading to its shelving until forensic technology advanced enough to utilize it. The police interviewed numerous witnesses, suspects, and persons of interest, but the only lead they discovered was a suspicious-looking van in the vicinity of Melissa's location on the day of her murder. Unfortunately, further inquiries failed to yield any information about the van or its owner. Despite their exhaustive efforts, The police were unable to apprehend Melissa's killer, leaving the community in fear while her family and friends mourned their devastating loss. As time passed, no new leads emerged, and the case remained unsolved, eventually growing cold. However, in 2014, authorities decided to re-examine the cold case, led by Lieutenant Peter Sherver. After reviewing the old case files and the evidence left behind from the initial investigation, the detectives knew they had to take action. Several years later, the evidence recovered from Melissa's body was submitted for testing, and in 2022, after 33 years, the detectives finally had a suspect. On April 26, 2022, Marvin McClendon Jr., a 74-year-old former Massachusetts corrections officer, was arrested in his home in Bremen, Alabama by the Alabama State Police for Melissa's murder. Although the specific details of the evidence used to establish his guilt were not disclosed to the public, the press release did mention that the evidence recovered from the body played a crucial role in identifying him as a suspect. As detectives delved deeper into McClendon's life, a series of incriminating details came to light. McClendon, a former employee of the Massachusetts Department of Corrections, was not working for the state in 1988. He had worked for the department on 3 separate occasions between 1970 and 2002. However, during the time of the murder, he was involved in carpentry work in Chelmsford, a locality near Lawrence. Investigators discovered that McClendon had several connections to Lawrence, the nearby town where the young girl's lifeless body was found near a set of train tracks. Their investigation revealed that McClendon frequented various locations within Lawrence, including the Seventh-day Adventist Church on Salem Street. Additionally, he owned a van that resembled the one witnesses saw Melissa near on the day she disappeared. These findings shed light on McClendon's proximity to the murder location, prompting further inquiry into his potential involvement in the crime. In 1988, McClendon, then 41 years old, had gained a reputation for having an uncontrollable temper and displaying violent and aggressive behavior when under the influence of alcohol. He was known to frequently visit strip clubs, engaging in inappropriate and disrespectful activities towards women. Furthermore, he was involved in sexual relations with women in the back of his van, further tarnishing his image. These facts were previously presented in a court hearing by his brother, Strasnick. Mr. McClendon was represented by a court-appointed attorney, Mr. Fassold, during his trial following his arrest. However, during a hearing, a probation employee testified that Mr. McClendon did not meet the criteria for appointed counsel. During the hearing concerning Henry Fassold's motion to dismiss, McClendon's defense attorney, his own brother Strasnick, presented arguments against the motion. He provided evidence countering Fassold's claim that the DNA evidence collected was insufficient to support a first-degree murder indictment against McClendon. According to court documents, McClendon's lawyer highlighted that his client willingly provided a DNA sample to investigators during his initial interview with Lieutenant Peter Sherver of the Massachusetts State Police, which occurred in Alabama in 2021. Despite using a walker, McClendon managed to make his way into Salem Superior Court on Tuesday, where he sat beside his attorney, Fassold. In April 2022, during a subsequent interview conducted by authorities, McClendon vehemently denied any involvement in Melissa's tragic demise. He maintained his innocence and even suggested that he may have been the victim of a meticulously orchestrated plot by inmates from the Massachusetts Department of Corrections, where he had previously worked. This statement not only attempted to shift blame, but also aimed to mislead the authorities. Strasnick emphasized that the DNA evidence collected from the crime scene matched the DNA profile of a male relative of McClendon, making it highly unlikely that it belonged to anyone else. Furthermore, he argued that the DNA evidence was just one piece of the puzzle, as there were other factors supporting the indictment against his brother. McClendon's attempts to absolve himself of responsibility did not end there. He proceeded to shift blame onto his own brother, Strasnick, displaying a treacherous betrayal and a willingness to sacrifice anyone to protect himself. His efforts to portray his own relatives as the mastermind behind the crime revealed a great deal about his disloyalty and lack of trustworthiness. He vehemently disputed the notion that his brother was factually innocent, presenting evidence of McClendon's erratic behavior leading up to and following the murder, arguing that these actions indicated guilt. Additionally, he highlighted McClendon's history of violence, making him a plausible suspect in the murder case. Fassold's statement suggested that the investigation focused on McClendon rather than his family members due to specific evidence available at the time, such as McClendon's left-handedness, potential connections to Lawrence, ownership of a van in 1988, lifestyle, and interactions with law enforcement during the investigation. However, this explanation seemed suspicious, potentially serving as an effort to absolve Mr. McClendon of any wrongdoing, and could be seen as a calculated and deceptive move. During the court proceedings, Judge Salim Tabit presided over a motion seeking to dismiss the case against the defendant, Mr. McClendon, who had been accused of first-degree murder. The judge attentively listened to the arguments presented in the motion and decided to carefully consider the matter before making a final decision. It is important to highlight that the charge of first-degree murder is an extremely serious offense, carrying the potential penalty of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Consequently, this case is being closely monitored by all parties involved, and the outcome of the upcoming hearing is expected to significantly impact the course of the trial. Despite Fassold's unsuccessful attempts to secure McClendon's release on a $50,000 bond, he remains detained without bond at Middleton Jail. Fassold also emphasized that there were no eyewitnesses to Tremblay's murder and no evidence suggesting that McClendon had any connection or motive to harm her. Nevertheless, McClendon is currently held in protective custody within a cell at Middleton Jail. As part of this confinement, he is only allowed to leave his cell when accompanied by a guard. This precautionary measure has been implemented to ensure McClendon's safety and the safety of others, considering the high-profile nature of the case and the potential risks associated with his involvement. By keeping him in protective custody, authorities can closely monitor his movements and interactions, thereby preventing any potential harm or disturbances within the jail or beyond. According to Sherry Carignan, a friend of Melissa who attended McClendon's arraignment, she was merely 10 years old when the crime took place. When she saw the defendant in court, she perceived him differently from what she had imagined. Melissa's family spokesperson, Danielle Root, conveyed that McClendon was described as an elderly and fragile individual. Shockingly, Melissa's lifeless body was discovered in a train yard in Lawrence on September 12, 1988, a day after she was reported missing. The family never anticipated that it would take over 3 decades for someone to be apprehended and brought to trial for Melissa's murder. Nevertheless, despite the lengthy delay, the family remains optimistic that the district attorney's office will exhibit the same level of commitment as the detectives who tirelessly pursue the suspect, Marvin McClendon. According to a statement, Root stated that there had been a lot of emotion since the end of April when they were informed of the arrest, ranging from excitement to sadness to frustration and all over the place. They were thrilled to see the suspect in jail, but also very saddened that some of their family members, such as their aunt, grandfather, and others were not alive to witness him facing justice. The statement went on to express gratitude to the police for their ongoing efforts throughout the years, and for the use of DNA technology that was not originally available to work the case. Root finished by saying that their family was looking forward to the case moving forward to the grand jury for indictment, and then on to the Superior Court to finally see justice served.
22-year-old Kyle Clinkscales, lived in LaGrange, Georgia, in 1976. The sports-obsessed young man was attending Auburn University in Alabama. At the university, he was beginning to search for his place in the world and mapping out what career to pursue. On January 27, 1976, Kyle left his part-time job at a bar in LaGrange and headed out for the roughly 45 minutes drive to Auburn University, where he was a sophomore. Kyle never made it to the university. When his parents could not get in contact with him, he was reported missing. Nothing out of the ordinary was found at Kyle's apartment to suggest that he ran away or had moved elsewhere. Investigators believed that something happened at some point on his trip. They just did not know what it could be. The Troup County Sheriff's Office and Kyle's parents intensively searched for him in those initial weeks after he went missing. Lakes were drained, rewards were promised. Deputies searched woodlands for a single clue. For Kyle's parents, John and Louise Clinkscales, the effort was a passionate, all-consuming quest, mirroring scores of other missing person cases across the country. With loved ones pleading for tips, searchers growing weary with each unsuccessful venture, and members of an exhausted community looking on aghast that something so haunting could have happened to one of their own, the determination was the source of admiration for many. Kyle Clinkscales had always liked New Orleans, so his parents bought ads in the city, asking for help to find their son. He loved Hawaii when he visited on some vacation as a boy. So his parents sent letters to every police department in the state. And when tips came in that a person had been found matching his description, strong jaw, shaggy brown hair, thick eyebrows, they drove to the places where those tips originated. 2 years after their son's disappearance, the Clinkscales had distributed nearly 5,000 bumper stickers seeking information. They became supporters for families of others who had missing relatives and tried to call attention to cases not as well publicized. The Clinkscales were among those invited to the White House in 1985 to meet with President Ronald Reagan about ways to address the issue of missing and exploited children in their home, the same one where Kyle Clinkscales had been raised, and that was decorated with pictures of him. His parents' drive to find their son would sometimes give way to fatigue. In an interview in 1978, John Clinkscales expressed unease. He said maybe his son, who did not really like college, had felt like he was a financial burden on his parents. Instead of dropping out or sharing his feelings, he might just have wanted to make it easier on us by disappearing, John said. Every time Louise and John Clinkscales left their home in LaGrange, Georgia to search for him, one of them would leave behind a note if their son returned while they were gone. They wanted him to know that a lot had changed since he was last seen in 1976. They loved him, the Clinkscales would write, and there on the dining room table was a spare car key for him. Both John and Louise Clinkscales submitted their DNA samples to investigators for testing, in case their son's remains were ever found. Sadly, John Clinkscales passed away in 2007. Louise passed away in January 2021 at the age of 92. A driver in Cosita, Alabama, about 30 miles southwest of LaGrange, was on a 2-lane road on December 7, 2021, when he saw the hatchback of a rusted vehicle sticking out of the creek and called the authorities. It was a 1974 Ford Pinto poking out from the creek. There were human remains inside the rusty car and about 50 skeletal fragments encased in the mud. It was not clear what allowed the car to become visible from the road after all this time. In February 2023, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation confirmed that the remains belonged to Kyle Clinkscales. The creek where the car was found in Chambers County, Alabama, outside of LaGrange, was never searched because the road would not likely have been Kyle's main route to Auburn, though it might have been an alternate one. Erin Hackley, the coroner in Troup County, Georgia, said that it might take investigators months to determine the exact cause, if they can pinpoint one at all, given the age of the remains. Hackley said when she got the call from investigators that the remains had been identified, she called Kyle's aunt, Martha Morrison, who responded with relief and regret that his parents were not alive to hear the news. Martha added, "They were very strong Christians. They had faith that things would work out for them, and they never gave up hope." When the remains of Kyle Clinkscales are returned to his relatives, we plan to drive to Shadow Lawn Cemetery in LaGrange. There, in the soft dirt between the graves of his mother and father, he will be buried, nestled in a space set aside years ago.